This episode is brought to you by WeatherGuard Lightning Tech. At WeatherGuard, we support design engineers and make lightning protection easy. You're listening to the Struck Podcast. I'm Dan Blewett.
I'm Alan Hall.
And here on Struck, we talk about everything aviation, aerospace engineering, and lightning protection. All right, welcome back to the Struck Podcast. I'm your co-host, Dan Blewett, and on today's show, got a couple of major topics, not as many scattershot ones today, but number one, we're going to chat about Chuck Yeager, the legendary pilot has passed away, so I know Alan's got a lot to say about his legacy. In our engineering segment, we'll talk about the 737 MAX and specifically how consumers can get confidence back in this plane, because I think it's really interesting. Most of us who are not aviation lifers, aerospace, engineers, we don't really know what happens with the FAA. I mean, we've heard on one hand, this is the most technologically amazing plane. Like it's one of the best planes ever created, but then it's crashed twice and it's been this villain of this story. So we'll talk about how those two pieces get married and how people get back flying in the 737 MAX with confidence. And lastly, we'll talk about Uber Elevate, who we did chat about last week, and they were sold to Joby Aviation right after we had recorded that show. So we're going to talk about Uber and Joby and that whole outlook. So Alan, number one, let's talk about Chuck Yeager. So who was Chuck Yeager?
Chuck Yeager is probably the most identifiable, recognizable test pilot in the world.
He's a legend, yeah.
Yeah, there's really two, I think. And in the Soviet side, it's turning to be Yuri Gagarin, just because flying into space, that's a big name as a test pilot. And on the American side, it tended to be Chuck Yeager. There's a couple others in America that people could rattle off if you're in aviation, but Chuck Yeager was always the one. And a lot of it had to do with the movie that was made based upon the book, The Right Stuff, that Tom Wolfe wrote years and years ago, back in the 80s. And the thing about Chuck Yeager, and if you're interested in aviation, you should read Chuck Yeager's book, the autobiography, because it explains a lot about his life. He came from, I believe it was West Virginia, if I remember correctly, as a kid. Really young, enlisted, wanted to fly. Ended up in World War II, shooting down some enemy aircraft. Got shot down in France. Hit out in France. Him and another pilot, I think he carried another injured pilot across the Pyrenees Mountains. And if you've ever been to the Pyrenees Mountains, you know, because he had to get to Spain. But if you've ever been to the Pyrenees Mountains or seen the Pyrenees Mountains, it's like the Rockies in the United States. Those mountains are huge, and it's cold up there, and there's snow on them. And they were evading German soldiers all the way to get to Spain. And once he got back into Spain, he got himself back to the United States, and then started flying again in combat. And then after the war, he ended up working in Ohio, at Dayton, Ohio for a little while, and then getting sent to Edwards Air Force Base, or Air Base, I guess at the time, and becoming a test pilot. Obviously, his most recognizable claim to fame was the first person to break the sound barrier back in 1947 with the Bell X-1, which was essentially a rocket ship with wings, and it was full of rocket motors. And he did it while he had a couple of busted ribs and a banged up shoulder, because he had fallen off a horse the night before.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's sort of crazy. He's not the biggest physical guy. At the time, a lot of test pilots, it's like astronauts at the time. They're not the tallest people you see in the world. They're not like athletes you see today, like at an NFL team or a baseball team. He's not a very tall person, but he's sort of built right for flying. And he has tremendous eyesight. His eyesight was unbelievably good. So the sort of the lore from Chuck Yeager in the aviation community was like he was the fastest, hottest test pilot forever. And I think there's a couple of things to remember about Chuck Yeager. And if you had followed Chuck Yeager on Twitter, Chuck Yeager was very active on Twitter until literally a couple of months ago. And his recollection and things that he would promote, or some of the things that he would remember or bring up, were just fascinating. And you can go back and look, because Twitter kind of archives that. You can go back and look at some of his discussions about breaking the sound barrier and some of the things that he did. But it also came with somewhat of a consequence. And this is the part I don't think you read a lot about. And I thought the news about Chuck Yeager passing away was actually very quiet. Maybe because he'd been around for a long time and people have sort of forgotten about all the things that he had done. But being in that life is very difficult. Being a flight test pilot at the time was extremely serious business because pilots died regularly. It isn't like today, where an airplane crashing is a big event. It is. An airplane crashing today is a big event. At the time when they were, let's just talk about late 40s, just after World War II, through the 1950s into the 60s, airplanes crashed all the time because they just didn't have the engineering. A lot of it was experimental, and they would just go out there and get the data. And that's what those flight test pilots are there for, was to go out and get the data so that the engineers could figure out how to get the aircraft to the next level. And Chuck Yeager had a couple of bad accidents, in which he was lucky to survive in. So it seems like he always had 9 lives, right? That was the thing about Chuck Yeager. He's always seemed to have 9 lives. I think if you don't want to read the book, watch the movie. Chuck Yeager in The Right Stuff. He's actually in that movie. He's a bartender at Pancho's ranch, which was a sort of place where pilots hung out in the desert at Edwards Air Force Base. And so he's in the movie there. You can see him in there. It's sort of funny if you sort of inside baseball there. But I think in today's world, he came out of a different era. And my wife was pointing out this morning, like, how old he was when he broke the sound barrier. He's in his early 20s. Right?
I was doing the math in my head. Yeah, he had to have been born in 1923, because he died in 97.
Yeah.
So
47.
1947, he's 24 years old.
Right.
Yeah.
And he'd already been a pilot in the World War. So he was young, right? And he's lucky. I mean, part of it's skill. Part of it's he had a lot of skill sets. He's smart. But he could get himself out of bad situations, or he could figure out a way not to get into bad situations. And he taught a lot of pilots. That's the other thing he did too. He trained a lot of pilots on how to fly airplanes. And it's just times have evolved in an odd sense when you think about that sort of personality type. Very strong-willed, very sort of military-based, which he was. He's in the military for a long time. And you just don't see a lot of that anymore. You just don't. And so I think it's really hard for especially kids now to even relate to something like that, because who's your hot test pilot today? We just sent up people to the space station a couple of weeks ago, and I couldn't name one of them.
Yeah.
Couldn't name one of them. Right? They just don't stick out like that. It's almost commonplace. The things that Chuck Yeager did back in the 40s and 50s were so uncommon. It just set the world on fire. But today we do them all the time. Breaking the sound barrier happens hundreds of times a day all around the world. Easily does. So, it's a huge loss. I think most of it is, for me, it's mostly about a loss of that kind of personality style of get up, do the hard work, put in, do the right stuff and make the world a little bit better. And, I think the military has a lot to be proud of there. I think that they do. And particularly Air Force totally does.
Well, and for me not knowing it, I actually am interested in reading his book. He seems to just like embody that cowboy mentality, like, of America. Like, he was just like, yep, let's do it. Let's break the sound barrier. He, like you said, he seemingly had 9 lives. It says that on a bunch of his flights, like you said, like in 1953, he was with he hit Mach 2.44 and hit inertia coupling. And had, like, the plane went into some violent roll and pitch motions, and he cut the engine and then, like, regained control of the plane 50,000 feet later.
Right.
It just sounds asinine. But he just, like I said, it just seems like the modern cowboy just wrangling planes, like all these new designs into control, like breaking stallions almost.
Yeah, I think it is like that. I would describe it somewhat like that. Yeah, but I think the thing that always sort of stuck out about Chuck Yeager, that he wasn't a cowboy in the sense that he was doing. I mean, obviously, he's in a dangerous field. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
But he took calculated risks. Right, he wouldn't put himself in a situation where he knew he was going to get killed. I don't think that was his way that things ran there. I think he had a good sense of how things work mechanically. I think he could understand what was happening in an airplane, how an airplane responded. If you read his Twitter feeds, the best airplane he ever flew was a P-51 Mustang. And it's one of the coolest airplanes ever. But that was the airplane that he ended up, into the end of World War II, ended up flying a good bit. And just because of the way it handled and how much power it had. And I think he learned a lot about how aircraft work and when to push forward and when to pull back a little bit. And when you're describing the time in which he, got up to, 80,000 feet and the airplane went crooked on him. And I think that's the one where he hit the cockpit canopy so hard with his helmet that he cracked the canopy. So, most people die in that situation. He was extremely lucky. And the time he got fire in his suit and all that. You should read the book, watch the movie. You don't have time, but the movie is very long. But it's a fascinating life, and it's sad to hear of his passing.
All right, so in our engineering segment today, we're going to talk about the 737 MAX. Obviously, last week in the show, we talked about the fact that it's back, right? It's been approved. It's airworthy again in the U.S., but that still doesn't change a lot of people's minds about it, right? Everyone's got a certain feeling. It was certainly like a villainized plane or vilified plane. And but yet, like you've said many times, FAA regulators and engineers are very competent, very thorough people. So, Alan, how can people be sure the 737 MAX is safe? And why should they trust it?
I think you should have trusted to begin with, in the sense that there was a lot of effort to make the aircraft safe. It wasn't like there was no indication, I still stand by this today. There was no indication in any of the reports or any of the data that came out of, hey, we're designing this aircraft to be risky or unsafe. There was, I think, normal banter for any sort of large organization complaining about whatever project they're working on. That's normal. But in terms of following the methodology and the logic to get to the point where the aircraft was certified at the time, and there is got to be some sense in the general public that the engineering on any aircraft program is not malevolent, that there's not any sort of bad intention here to push anything by, to put some sort of unsafe aircraft in the air because you're trying to profit on it. I can guarantee you that not a single engineer that worked on that product got a pay raise because it got out sooner. That just doesn't go on like that, right? This is not Wall Street, right? It is a very regulated, very monitored. It's an 8 to 5 kind of job to do those things. No one has a vested interest in it, so to speak. You may own some Boeing stock, but that's about it. You're not going to get independently wealthy off it. So the intentions, I think, are good, right? I think from the engineering standpoint, you're like, yeah, they checked all the boxes, they did their homework, they understood what the risks were. A thing that bit them, two parts. I think the thing that bit the 737 was the AOA probe having problems, and the repaired AOA probes having problems that were not verified or caught before they were installed. And the pilots had issues controlling the aircraft, even after the service bulletin had been put out to say, if the airplane noses over, or you have some sort of uncommanded horizontal stab issue, shut it off. And they had commands to do that. They had instructions to do that. And in that second crash, either the pilots were not informed of it or they just ignored it. Who knows? You're never going to find out that. But in terms of the safety of an aircraft, there is tens of thousands of hours of research and study and testing and effort that goes into making sure those aircraft are safe enough that your family is okay to fly on them. And I would almost guarantee you that there's 99.9% of the people that worked on that aircraft would fly on it a year ago as they would today. So I think we need to be very careful about the way some portion of the media likes to blow things up, and not so much to blow them up or to portray them. And the way that congressional representatives or representatives in Congress like to do that too, because it gives them a platform to create turmoil, to create votes, whatever their intentions are, get on television, God knows what. But take a step back a minute, right? Things we're reading today, if you're getting your advice on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram about anything to do with anything engineering, it's the wrong place. You got the wrong resources. You're just making really bad decisions. Those are not resources for anybody to do anything with. And it's fine if you're checking out to see how the neighbor's vacation went. Awesome. But to rely on sort of the hearsay garbage that goes on in social media to make decisions about what airplane you want to fly on, that is ridiculous. Dig a little bit deeper, find better resources than that. And that's probably one of the most frustrating things about aviation today is a lot of the discourse that goes on isn't valid, but it's not worth anything because then nobody knows, right? If you read an article in I don't want to name any publications, but if you read an article about 737 MAX from a typical generic journalist, not someone who delves into aviation, that article is full of just errors, flat out errors. And you read them all the time, right? But if I'm in the general public, I don't know that. I have no idea. I have to rely upon the sources that are laying in front of me. I think that's the sort of the Gelman problem that we have, is that the resources that you have to make educated decisions are not there. They're not there, or the problem is so complex you can't make a decision about it anyway. So I don't know if there's a real answer to it, Dan. I don't know. But right now it's just probably a bad time because the election's gone over, and anytime you're on social media, like Twitter's making comments about the election, and like who at Twitter is making those decisions? Like they don't know anything about anything. And they don't know anything about airplanes either. That's one thing they can guarantee they don't know anything about is airplanes and aircraft safety. They have no idea how the process is done. They have no idea all the effort that's gone into it. And it doesn't mean every product it pushes out is perfect, but it doesn't mean that there's sort of some bad intentions there. And I still feel like there is this part of the journalistic community that is pushing there was some malfeasance, bad actors on the Boeing side or on the airline side for that matter. I don't think those are true. I think what it comes down to, there was an accident, and if situations were slightly different, they wouldn't happen. It's a connection of a series of roughly random events that all seem to line up for the worst time. It's awful that those things happen, and we learn from them. And if there's anything that's happened in the last 10 months, is Boeing's learned a ton about certifying an airplane again.
All right, so in our final segment today, where we talk about eVTOLs and electric tech, we're going to revisit Uber Elevate and their recent sell to Joby Aviation. So we chatted about Uber Elevate last week, and a lot of uncertainty. Like, what are they doing? What is their role in eVTOL development? And of course, just like clockwork, a couple of days later, out comes the news that yes, they're getting rid of that arm. And also, they've sold off pretty much all of their future forecasting arms of the business. Uber has sold a $500 million stake in Uber Freight. Right. They've sold off their autonomous vehicle section, which was an Aurora innovation. So, Alan, what is Uber doing, and why are they shedding all of these sort of like future-looking assets?
Well, I noticed this a couple of weeks ago. If you had watched the LinkedIn profiles for people that worked in the upper echelon of Uber Elevate, they were leaving the company. and going on to new ventures, not defined. They didn't have, it didn't say they had a position in another company necessarily. It was like they were just leaving. And that, as an investor, if and I'm not invested in Uber, thank God, but if I were an investor, I would have been really worried about that, because those kind of departures indicate there's people leaving because this organization is about to end or be substantially restructured in a not a positive way. So when those departures happen, like, man, this is not good. And Uber has been in trouble financially because they really haven't created a profit center yet. They're still looking for profit, right? They're still living on investment money, essentially. So as 2020 drags on and less people are using Uber as a transportation service, there's just not enough cash to keep things floating. You have to cut everything that you don't need. And if you think about how Boeing has cut off their sort of experimental eVTOL section of their business out in St. Louis, they cut that off, and a lot of other aircraft companies that have the rights to be in that space have stopped all work. It made no sense for Uber to be in that anymore. And I think I listened to podcasts talk about what is happening in sort of the Joby Uber space and what possible connection there is. I don't think there's any possible connection besides you can cut out Uber funding anything else, right? If you have control of that sort of marketplace on how to deliver your service to customers, which Uber does, awesome. But Uber's not investing in any other eVTOL company, that's for sure. Elevate's not. So if you look at the financial landscape and the engineering landscape and the eVTOL market, you have to, if you're looking at serious contenders right now, you need to find the contenders that have at least $500 million in investment money available to them today. If you don't have $500 million in investable funds today, you're not going to get to the finish line in the near future. You're just not. And Joby has Toyota money. Lilium has some big investors. Volocopter may have some investors. Not totally sure about how they're doing. But Wisk had Larry Ellison money. It did at one point. It doesn't sound like that's going on in the future. But as an outside investor, Dan, if you saw a company that was going to talk about spending $500 million to create an airplane, and they don't have $500 million available to them, as an outside investor, are you investing in that company at a small level? I would say no, right? I wouldn't, because whatever I invested in it is at high risk and most likely just going to go away.
Yeah, and I don't own Uber stock either. It just seems at some point like it comes due, and it seems like this is a good move by Uber that they're finally trying to stick to their core business and become profitable, because for forever, I mean, they're not a young company anymore and they're still not turning a profit. So at some point it's like, look, we can't just keep trying to expand and change the future of transportation. Like, let's try to make money today and then take it one step at a time. And it seems like that's what they're doing, which makes sense. Like they bought Lime, the scooter company, and I don't know how that acquisition's doing, but Lime it's here in DC. It's in a lot of the major cities, right? It seems like it's a prominent, it's certainly a prominent, scooter sharing arm of their business now. And then I know Lime has just acquired the company Jump, which also had scooters, but more so electric bikes, because I've seen them rebranded here in DC as well. So those are all like real today technologies. Like, people are taking electric bikes, they're taking rental bikes that are not electric, they're taking rental scooters, and they're taking Ubers around. So those are like the things that make sense today, or if they're trying to, bring their cash back to the heart of the business and actually get profitable, that seems to be a good move. So yeah, it just seemed like you and I were talking about Uber Elevate off and on the last, whole 6 months. And it's like, what is Uber Elevate and what are they doing? Are they really going to build all these planes? Are they going to build these locations, these airports for them on top of Manhattan skyscrapers? Like, what is their end game? And it's just like they want to throw their money and be Uber everything, but it seems like it's just hard to do that today with Lyft being a major competitor and all these other companies that are major competitors to, like, self-driving cars. Like, are they going to beat Tesla to the market? Like
No.
they weren't,
No,
right?
No.
So it's like, well, why are we in that race? Like, let's just try to do a couple of things well. And it seems like that's what they're doing.
Well, in their business model, I think they've pitched a Amazonish business model for a while, which is that they're a consignment company. They don't own the car. They just get a percentage of the deal, right? They provide the software to connect driver with user, and every one of those transactions, you get to keep a percentage of it. It's a consignment. And aircraft are not like that. I don't know in what world they thought aircraft are going to be like that, because aircraft are expensive, and they don't tend to have independent operators. That doesn't tend to be the model, because aircraft are expensive to operate and to own, unlike a $20,000 car, or Kia of some sort. It's totally different marketplace. And I do think, again, let's look at the upside downside risk to this. If one of my Uber drivers, and it's not an employee of Uber, he's an independent contractor, gets into a car accident, nobody knows. You're not reading the newspaper or see anything about that. But I guarantee you, if one of the Uber Elevate aircraft eVTOLs hits the dirt, it's going to be on the front page of every newspaper. It's just basically the same discussion I was listening to today about automatic or automated trucks that could deliver packages across the country. The first accident that happens there is going to stop that business from happening. And it's the same thing here. It really is.
All right. Well, that'll do it for today's episode of Struck. If you're new to the show, thank you so much for listening, and please leave a review and subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out the WeatherGuard Lightning Tech YouTube channel for video episodes, full interviews, and short clips from the show. And follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Our handle is @WGLightning. Tune in next Tuesday for another great episode on aviation, aerospace engineering, and lightning protection. Strike Tape, WeatherGuard Lightning Tech's proprietary lightning protection for radomes, provides unmatched durability for years to come. If you need help with your radome lightning protection, reach out to us at weatherguardaero.com. That's weatherguardaero.com.